Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Are Boris Johnson's days numbered as British Prime Minister? If you've been reading the usually supportive British tabloids over the past few days, you'd probably conclude it's just a question of time. The controversy over the COVID rule-breaking Christmas party, the cover-up, the admission, the apology to the House of Commons. Well, this week there'll be a by-election, a vote on a new MP for a safe Tory seat, safe since 1997. This is seen as a chance for voters of North Shropshire in central England to deliver a verdict on how Prime Minister Johnson is handling or mishandling the COVID pandemic, the post-Brexit world, and the cut and thrust of everyday politics where he's been branded a liar more than once. It's 2 years almost to the day when Johnson went to the country in a general election and won by a landslide 80-seat majority. Would he be able to secure anything like that now? We're running the rule over Boris Johnson as British Prime Minister. Our guests joining us by Skype from London. Georgia Gilholy, who's a political reporter with Politico.co.uk and commentator with Young Voices UK. Thanks for being with us. On the set here in Paris, Philip Turle, our very own international affairs editor. Great to see you, sir. And also from London, by Skype, Andrew Blick, head of the Department of Political Economy and reader in politics and contemporary history at King's College, again there in the English and British capital. Before we let loose the guests, let's watch some of Boris Johnson's headline moments, often headline moments in the worst sense of the phrase.
I apologise. I apologise for the impression that has been given that staff in Downing Street take this less than seriously. I'm sickened myself and furious about that. But I repeat what I have said to him, that I've been repeatedly assured that the rules were not broken. Order. Forgive me. It's time for some of our dearest friends around the world to, prenez un grip about all this, and donnez-moi un break. Yesterday I went, as we all must, to Peppa Pig World. I don't know if you've been to Peppa Pig World. Hands up anyone who's been to Peppa Pig World? Not enough. I was a bit hazy what I would find at Peppa Pig World, but I loved it. And Peppa Pig World is very much my kind of place.
Boris Johnson established a reputation on being entertaining. Perhaps the joke isn't funny anymore. Let's bring in our guests to get their take on the current situation. Starting with Georgia Gilholy, joining us from London with Politico.co.uk and Young Voices UK. Georgia, thanks for being with us here. What are your thoughts on the present situation regarding Boris Johnson?
I think you almost summarised it perfectly in what you just said. Boris has obviously always been a big personality ever since he was, a journalist, when he was the Mayor of London, when he was backbench MP, then Foreign Secretary, and obviously he became Prime Minister. A lot of people, I think, many people who aren't necessarily the biggest fans of the Conservative Party in the UK, they sort of felt a bit of a rapport with him. They felt his charisma, and I think as well because he sort of came out strongly for Brexit. A lot of ordinary people who voted for Brexit, sort of that chimed with them. Though I think absolutely the joke, if it ever was funny, it's certainly not funny right now, and it hasn't been for a long time, in my opinion. That CBI speech was a train wreck, really. There was no need to go on that kind of rant that he did. Obviously, everyone, loses place in a speech, whatever. That's it happens, right? But the way he dealt with it, he came across as fundamentally unserious. I remember I was watching it live and it was just utterly cringeworthy. But obviously the more important thing outside of, that one speech is he's just unserious in the way that he approaches pretty much everything. He backtracks, he lies. And I think, if you look at some of the polls, they are showing that people are starting to turn against him. Over 50% of people polled last week said that he should resign over, the rumours of Downing Street parties, which I think we can pretty much confirm several of them definitely happened now. Whether or not, he would get an 80-seat majority now, I don't think he would, if an election happened now, though I do think the Conservatives would still get a majority. And I think that's because Labour isn't really providing the opposition that it could. It's not to say that it speaks of the strength of his leadership or of the Conservative Party in this moment. It's just sort of a matter of the situation right now.
Indeed, it makes you wonder what Labour have to do to actually get a lead, doesn't it? Georgia, thank you very much indeed. We'll come back to you very, very shortly. Let's bring in Andrew Blick, head of the Department of Political Economy and Reader in Politics and Contemporary History at King's College. Andrew, Boris Johnson, old Etonian, but somehow managed to convince everybody he was a man of the people. All that, I imagine, has been erased by now.
I think certainly he's encountering some difficulties, as has already been said. He's got a certain style. That was part of his appeal, but it can wear a bit thin, and it's certainly doing that now. I don't think we should be particularly surprised that his style has worn a bit thin, and that he's getting into these kind of difficulties involving money and a slightly flexible attitude towards truth, because after all, these are things that were well known about him long before he became an MP. But these are kind of patterns of behaviour he displayed. So we shouldn't be surprised. I suppose one question to ask is, all prime ministers at some point experience a dip in popularity, and it's very normal actually, historically, for oppositions to lead midterm by a considerable margin, which is not something that's going on at the moment. So I suppose the question for us, and perhaps even more of a question for his own party, his own parliamentary party, is this cyclical? Is it something that he'll rebound from? Or is it more permanent damage than that he's not going to recover from? And if so, what is the alternative? Because that is a question that the Conservative Party needs to ask itself, and no doubt it is asking itself. Have they got someone who can provide some of what he was able to provide in terms of charisma, that was almost able to paper over some of the gaps in what is a very, very loose coalition of a party, really?
Indeed. Georgia, Andrew, thank you both very much. You've set this up for me completely, in fact, doing my job for me. Thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Philip Turle, our International Affairs Editor here in Paris. Philip, what we've just heard there really I think, sums up some of the things that show how Boris Johnson managed to capture the public imagination. And I suppose you could add to that the fact that he appeared on quiz shows and seemed to be this very jolly figure who was at once erudite but also somehow able to have the common touch. But it all seems to have fallen apart now. A train wreck, as Georgia described his speech at the CBI.
I don't think that we should dismiss Boris Johnson quite just yet, because this man has a habit of being able to rebound and pick up the pieces. This certainly, I think, is the most serious challenge that he has faced, not only to the fact that he's Prime Minister, but also to the leadership of the Conservative Party and the way he's perceived by the British public. And what we've just been talking about is true, that he's the sort of jovial person who gives her the idea that he's a nice guy, that you could go and have a drink with him, he's a laugh. He's like the fun side of politics, where some of his predecessors have been very serious and not much fun, and not only on the Conservative side, but also on the Labour side. So people like the charisma of Boris Johnson. People have always enjoyed his gaffes, his phrases, the way he reacts. And you're right, it goes back to, he was on this quiz show called Have I Got News for You on the BBC, where he became a household name. And he's one of the only politicians that I've ever known where he's universally known by his first name, Boris. People don't even use the name Johnson. So he's someone who has built up this reputation, this image of the jovial guy, and it's worked. And he's bought into the Labour heartland in the north of England, broken the red wall. He's created this image of someone who has his heart in the future of the UK, and he was the one who created Brexit, and all the charisma's gone with it. But now it's catching up with him, all the lies, all the sleaze, all the doubts, all the criticism of how he handled the COVID crisis right from the start, the delays in bringing in the measures, all of those things are coming to a head. And now the question is, will he be able to survive? Will the Conservative Party see him as the man who can lead it to the next election and win that next election? Or does it think, okay, this is the beginning of the end of the Boris Johnson era. It's time to get rid of him. It's a ruthless party. They won't give him the benefit of the doubt. They don't think he's going to win. He won't get through and be the candidate. That is the most important challenge that Boris is facing right now.
Indeed. So he wins 2 years ago with a landslide 80-seat majority. And it's, it would have taken quite a reading of a crystal ball to foresee the situation that would be facing him right now. Let's bring Georgia back in from politico.co.uk and Young Voices. George, you were talking about how the Labour Party perhaps isn't capitalising on this situation. And I think I said one wonders what they have to do to get it right and why they're not getting it right. Is there something about how Johnson connects with ordinary people, do you think? For better or for worse?
I think this idea that Boris Johnson himself is some kind of, absolute electoral star is a bit of a myth. I mean, obviously, the Conservatives, they had an excellent result at the last election. However, many people sort of just think, well, a paper bag could have won against Jeremy Corbyn. And we even saw Theresa May, managed to get them, the Conservatives as the largest single party when that was just a disastrous campaign in 2017. And I think that while they obviously had an excellent electoral campaign, I think his sort of star quality is over-egged a little bit. And I think a lot of the people going into that election, they were voting because they wanted Brexit to happen. So if someone similar to Boris Johnson, I think it's just sort of, he happened to be there in the moment and he sort of fit into that slot. It's not necessarily that he was this, genius, unique leader, and obviously he was surrounded by tons of advisors who sort of shaped the campaign. I think it was very much about Brexit, and you can imagine someone else, if they had picked up on that more, could have won that result, or maybe even better. Obviously, that's sort of a counter history. And I think that a lot of people were very, very sceptical of Jeremy Corbyn for obvious reasons. So I think, unless something absolutely insane had happened, the Conservatives were always going to win that election because of Corbyn and mainly because of Brexit. And I think when you talk about the Labour Party not providing a proper or a rigorous opposition, I think we can talk about COVID, obviously, but Brexit is the main issue when it came to that election. And I think in a lot of ways, thinking about how people perceive the Labour Party right now, because it's led by Sir Keir Starmer, who, for all his, obvious talents, he was an ex-chief prosecutor of the CPS, obviously a very intelligent guy. He was absolutely spearheading the People's Vote campaign, having the second referendum. That's not what most British people wanted. They wanted, most voters voted for Brexit who voted in the election. In the referendum in 2016. And then that was confirmed by 2017, and especially obviously by what happened in 2019. I think that although Keir Starmer's, trying to do a good job of sort of rebranding himself, and also of trying to sort of make the Labour Party more central after what happened under Jeremy Corbyn, I think that he's trying to, pull two sides together. He's trying to, argue on the one hand that we can have sort of a reasonable Brexit policy, whatever, because really we're still negotiating Brexit right now. The Northern Ireland Protocol is not really a settled matter. It's still sort of an ongoing issue. He's trying to sort of do that while many people in those traditional Labour seats see him maybe even as a traitor. And then he's trying to bring the Labour Party to the centre ground, which is obviously where it operates better in terms of elections. But so many grassroots people in Labour are young, very far left people who joined in momentum to campaign for Jeremy Corbyn. So he's really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And when it comes to COVID, overwhelmingly, MPs in general, and especially as well in the Labour Party, they're in favour of more restrictions. So he can't really sort of pose himself as this kind of anti, lockdown, or saying the Conservatives shouldn't be bringing in Plan B or the other plans that they have already done and have going forward. So he doesn't really have that, even though,
So,
to be
Georgia,
honest, most
Keir
people are in
Starmer, as you
favour
say,
of
not
Brexit.
able to really exploit the failings of Boris Johnson at this precise moment in time. Georgia, I need to pause you. Let me bring in Andrew for a comment on those issues, and certainly about Brexit, Andrew, the situation, as George is saying, still very much Brexit is key to many people. Many issues still haven't been sorted out. I'm thinking from the perspective where we're sat in Paris, there's the issue about fishing licenses, which is still a very controversial issue. Fishing fleets, farmers, among those who will be dissatisfied in the UK with how Brexit has turned out. And once upon a time, they were told that their needs and their situation was key to the Brexit campaign.
Yes, and I think I'm actually going to have to disagree with the previous comments on some of this, because I think that if you look at Labour's campaign in 2019, they actually lost more votes in that election to anti-Brexit parties, such in particular the Democrats and the Green Party, than they did to the Conservatives. Where I think Johnson was very effective was in marshalling all the Brexit, or an overwhelming majority of Brexit voters behind the Conservatives. Where Labour were actually less effective was in marshalling all of the Remain voters together behind one party. And if you look at Corbyn as a leader, I mean, it was well known, in fact, that he was, if anything, a leader himself. So I think to suppose that Labour Party's problem is it's not seen as pro-Brexit enough is a misinterpretation. And in fact, I think probably Labour's weakness is that, for reasons that were rightly alluded to by Georgia, that it's difficult for them to actually be more anti-Brexit because of a relatively small number of their previous voters that they lost to the Conservatives in 2019. But the overwhelming majority of Labour voters, Labour supporters, are pro-Remain, and would probably rather, and the polling suggests it, would probably rather that the UK had never left the European Union. So I think here's an area where potentially, if Starmer could figure out a strategy that works for him, he could actually go on the attack. But to go on the attack on Johnson over Brexit involves reviving the idea that Labour are an anti-Brexit party. I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because I think the evidence so far is that Brexit hasn't delivered on any of the things that really, any of the supposed benefits it claimed to. I think you could make a very strong claim to that effect. As I could also think you could make the claim that there was no other form of Brexit deal that would have been much better either. But at the moment, I think Labour's position is quite confused on that issue, and they almost seem to be talking about another deal, back to a kind of have your cake and eat it deal, where we can be outside of the rules but still have the benefits. But I think at some point, maybe at some point, the UK probably going to wake up to the fact that's not possible.
Indeed. I'm kind of wondering, I mean, because I come from one of those red wall constituencies. I grew up in one of those places which was staunchly Labour, and I think I'm right in remembering that it is still Labour. But so many of those places, as Philip was saying earlier, fell during the last election. And on that issue of Brexit, which cut straight across all political thinking and sort of recalibrated how people looked at politics and looked at themselves and looked at the parties, and they associated with Boris Johnson. I think that's the thing. Do you think, Andrew, just keeping you here with us for a second now, do you think that somehow Johnson has the talent politically, the people talent to sort of reconnect in that way? Or do you think that at this stage now, with what we've seen over the past few weeks and what we may see later this week and what happens in the next by-election, that perhaps it's gone too far?
Potentially it has. I mean, things unravel for every Prime Minister in the end. However powerful they are, Margaret Thatcher won 3 elections in a row. Within about 3 years of winning a 3rd election, her own party removed her. Things always unravel in the end. All political careers end in failure. It's just that we don't always know until it's happened. So it's very difficult to pick. He's certainly got big problems, but as already been said, I wouldn't write him off just yet, because most Prime Ministers have a difficult patch, and maybe they come back from their first difficult patch. But one thing I would say, he does have a capacity for own goals. These are unforced errors. If you look at the big challenge that, say, Gordon Brown met, it was the global financial crisis. Now, despite what we're told, that wasn't actually his fault. But it's something that came up on his watch. It was a big challenge for him. These challenges come along, but if you look at all the problems Johnson has got at the moment, they actually arise from his own errors, his own personality. And I think the problem is that he's got the potential to carry on creating these problems. I don't think it's going to go away. I don't think he's going to turn into a different person. We know what he's like. It's now widely known. Once people used to like him for it, maybe they don't as much. And I think that at some point it is going to unravel. So it's the question of when, and it will be of his own making. But I think the person who's going to replace him is probably going to be another Conservative and not a Labour person beating a general election.
Andrew Blick, King's College, thank you. Georgia Gilholy from Young Voices and Politico.co.uk, thank you. And Philip Toll, still here in the studio. More from you three in a moment. Let's now take a listen to the words of a former Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, colourful character you may remember for his loud ties and his equally loud manner, a very erudite man and a very serious man as well. His words on Boris Johnson on British TV a few days ago.
Now, the person who is in charge of the ship is regarded as a serial dissembler. I'm sorry to say it, but I've known 12 prime ministers in my lifetime, and by a country mile, Boris Johnson is the worst. His natural instinct is not to be open, not to be transparent, not to be accountable, but narcissistically to think, what suits me? How can I extricate myself from this awkward situation? By what means can I arrogate blame somewhere else?
John Bercow, former Speaker of the House of Commons. Philip Toll, in all your experience as a reporter and a correspondent, have you ever heard anybody talk about a Prime Minister in that way?
No, but I don't think we've seen a Prime Minister like Boris Johnson before. This is the first time that in my lifetime I've known someone so eccentric, someone who actually lies so much, and it's easy to prove that. I mean, one of the questions that I always said someone should ask Boris Johnson if they get the chance. Now we know the answer to this, but only since September, is how many children do you have, Mr. Johnson? Because he would actually never say how many children he had. So now we know that he just had a seventh baby because he finally admitted in September he had 6 children. So all these lies that have been put forward, I think there are 2 aspects here. The first one was that people were willing to accept that. It was part of the package. You voted for Boris, you got what you voted for. You got the bumbling politician, the charismatic guy, the narcissist, and you got the liar. But it was a package that was sort of amusing. The problem now is that shine is wearing off. And it is true what we've been saying, that if you compare Boris Johnson to Jeremy Corbyn, then obviously Boris was much more charismatic and brilliant, more fun than Jeremy Corbyn. So he brought in the punters, he brought in the voters. And Labour has been completely split over, well, do we support Brexit or not? And even Jeremy Corbyn was known to be anti-EU. So that played into the hands of what Boris Johnson was pushing forward as his policy to leave the EU. So people bought into that because Labour couldn't put up a big enough fight and an argument to remain in the EU. And as for the Social Democrats, they're almost non-existent. So Boris had a clear boulevard in front of him to sell the Brexit deal with these little phrases like, let's get Brexit done, the Evan-ready deal, the global Britain, all these catchy phrases that were going to help him get elected and then do what he wanted to do. That's fine. But now we have something else. We have the COVID crisis. We have the fact that people see that, OK, we accept a few lies, but now the lies that we are seeing that have happened, especially over the parties at Downing Street last year, people in the UK were prevented from seeing their loved ones when they were dying because they were obeying government rules to stay at home, not to mingle. Whereas we see the government having the party in Downing Street, Boris Johnson, a photo of him taking part in a quiz show with someone wearing a hat and one next to him and the other one with tinsel on. People are going to say, well, OK, we put up with that for a while and this has gone a bit too far. And so that is what is the threat facing Boris Johnson now, is will people put up with this anymore? Will he be able to fight back and say, OK, I was wrong, but he's already proved that he's lied again, saying he didn't know about the party, and there are pictures of him taking part in it. So he is facing a very serious challenge, not only from the public, but also within the party, because the party is beginning to say, OK, the shine is wearing off. He could be a danger for the party, and that is going to be a serious threat for him. OK, I want to explore that in a moment. First, I want to ask about Plan B. Plan B, Georgia mentioned it earlier on. Georgia, you mentioned Plan B. Let's bring Georgia Gilholy back into... Well, basically, I'll put the question to you, Georgia. You're there in London. You know people in London. You live there. You socialise. Are people going to follow Plan B, or are they watching
with great interest what happened last Christmas at number 10 and thinking, well, why should we? It's one rule for them, one rule for us.
In terms of most things, sort of mass swearing on public transport, in shops, that kind of business, I think people generally just get on with it, from what I've seen so far in London. Obviously, London being pretty busy compared to a lot of places. But in terms of mixing households and that kind of thing, right now we are allowed to do that legally. But I think the real issue is going to come in if they try to sort of crack down on that in the lead up to Christmas. And I do think realistically most people aren't going to follow it because, number one, they do see the hypocrisy of what happened and they think, you know what, I might as well just do what I want in terms of Christmas, see my family or whatever. That's what I'm doing because, we know that everyone else is going to do it. Ministers, government are probably doing it, so let's just do it anyway. But on the other hand, I do think a lot of people do just feel safer because vast majority of people in the UK are double vaccinated. We're also now able to get the booster jab, or at least we're going to be offered it, before the end of the year. So I think while, we can't rule out what could happen with the new variant, I think most people do just feel safer, and it's not even necessarily about the hypocrisy, though I do think a lot of people are thinking about that and discussing it. And I guess we'll see, if that does linger at the polls next election.
Georgia, thank you. Andrew, can I bring you on the same issue? Plan B, what price the Plan B when we've seen everything being basically flouted by the Conservatives?
Yeah, I think the main opposition to Plan B comes from within the Conservative Party itself, comes from the rebels within the Conservative Party, who are one of these factions with multiple factions within the party. It would make life really difficult for any leader of the Conservative Party. But I think the public at large, polling suggests that actually public support for greater measures is actually pretty high. So whether they'll comply, obviously, is a different matter. But when asked, they tend to be quite supportive of stricter measures. There's a vocal minority against it. But I think there's definitely evidence of public support for them. However, there's certainly, I think, been a problem of confused messaging from the government, not just starting now, but from the beginning of the whole pandemic. There's been confused messaging from the government about what's going on, trying to convey optimism about things going to be over quite soon when we just don't know, confusion about what we're supposed to be doing, and then these problems. And let's not forget he's now almost a member of the opposition, but the Dominic Cummings episode of more than a year ago, when he went on the infamous trip to his family home and then up to Barnard Park and all those things, and there's apparently there was evidence of breaking rules. So these things have gone on throughout the pandemic, and the government's taken rather confused line on. So that is a problem. And I suppose the origins of some of that problem, the confused messaging and the reluctance sometimes to lock down as quickly as they might, has come from, again, the pressure from within Johnson's own party.
Indeed, that famous episode of Dominic Cummings, Andrew, taking his, he said he was testing his eyes, didn't he, when he drove to Barnard Castle, which broke several regulations on COVID at that time. Philip, can I bring you back in? Andrew, talking about the rebellion that Johnson's facing within his own party on this Plan B.
Yeah, actually, just to bounce back on what he was just saying, Boris Johnson was heavily criticised for his handling of the COVID crisis during the first lockdown and the second lockdown. Even that famous phrase, let the bodies pile up in the streets. What his redeeming fact was that Britain then went ahead with the vaccine rollout, and that pulled back the popularity of Boris Johnson because they rolled it out really quickly. It became the first country in the world to vaccinate so many people. If you listen to what Boris Johnson was saying last night on the television, he went on TV Sunday evening saying, you've got to get out there. We're facing a tsunami of COVID, of Omicron coming into the UK. You've got to get out there and get vaccinated. Get your booster shot. And today, the queues are really long, like 4 or 5 hours of people waiting to get their vaccine booster. So it is having an effect, and that could be a redeeming factor for Boris Johnson. But what he faces, which is this major challenge which could make or break, in a way, tomorrow, in the House of Commons is a vote on these four, what they're called statutory instruments, to 6:30 British time, and they are on the wearing of face masks, on the isolation rules, on more COVID, the use of COVID passes. He's mellowed that down a little bit, and on the compulsory vaccinations. And the last count were like 75 rebel MPs in the House of Commons from within the Conservative Party, which is almost the majority that he has in the House of Commons, which is 80, are willing to go against that and say, we're not going to vote for it. And that is a major problem for Boris Johnson. So what's he going to do? Well, he's going to get support from the Labour Party, and it will probably go through. But it doesn't look good for him when he's got this big rebellion within the Conservative Party itself. Because remember, he had an 80-seat majority, which is like a huge majority when he won the election back in 2019. So he faces a big challenge. But as I said before, it doesn't mean his time in office is over and done with, because he has a fantastic ability to be the Teflon man. Things can slide off him and then bounce back when everybody says, well, it's over for him. Remember back when there was when he prorogued Parliament back in 2019 to get the Brexit deal done, everyone was saying, well, he lied to the Queen, he misled Parliament, he'll be out. Well, he wasn't. And he's still here now. So be a little bit cautious before everyone says, he'll be out by Christmas. Not sure. Even the Daily Mail and the Sun, though, the traditional supporters, are kind of turning against him, aren't they, on these issues? They are, but they are looking for readers, and they will go with what the general sway is. They will support him. If he suddenly bounces back, they'll say, look at Boris, he's coming back, this is wonderful. I think you have to look more like at The Guardian or the Daily Mirror, and then you see the real criticism of Boris Johnson. The others, well, they will criticise him when they think the time is right to criticise him, but they would swing back and support him if they thought it was going to bring back in the readers again. Indeed, regardless of what you think of The Sun, it tends to sort of have its finger on the pulse of British politics, doesn't it? I mean, Tony Blair, it all changed for him and the Labour Party when The Sun decided to support the Labour Party way back. Yeah, well, the British press has a real swaying power in deciding the outcome of elections. You're right about the win when Labour were given as favourites to win the election, and they lost because the Sun ran with this headline: "The last person leave the UK, turn the light out," and everyone thought, well, maybe we won't. Neil Kinnock. It was for when John Major became Prime Minister. Indeed, I can recall. I'm old enough to recall when Michael Foot was demolished by the Sun as well. So the Sun, a very influential, whatever you think of it, very influential paper. Georgia, can I bring you back in to comment on Boris Johnson in terms of his timing of the speech, the address to the public on Sunday? I mean, clearly there was a real pressing reason to do it. Also a good reason politically for him. It kind of deflected attention from some of his gaffes.
Yeah, I think after that sort of emergency COVID briefing he obviously had, I think probably the advice was just the best thing to do if we want to if we want to sort of slow down the spread of Omicron or decrease it, is for most people to get the booster jab. So I think that's sort of the straightforward reason why he made that announcement. When I was watching, I was thinking, I mean, okay, this is sort of just a repeat of, everything the government had already been saying, that they were trying to turbocharge, in that words, the booster rollout. But I think, I suppose if you want that impact and the gravitas, you want to tell everyone, we're going to be addressing the nation at this time, and everyone will tune in. And I think, clearly a lot of people did go out and try and queue up to get the booster jab today, which is good. But yeah, personally, I'm going to be waiting until it's less busy. I agree with what you were just saying about how it's definitely premature to say, Boris is going to be out soon. I really don't think that's going to happen. An interesting thought I saw on Twitter a few days ago from Mary Harrington, who's a contributing editor over at Unheard, who always has some interesting thing to say. She sort of argued that while a lot of this drama is cutting through to the public, there's no obvious successor for Boris Johnson and the Tory party right now. And I think her argument really was that why would they want to be his successor right now? We're still in the middle of a pandemic and dealing with that. So it would definitely make more sense for someone to stand up and challenge him, whether that's after the next election or before it, once we're sort of more out of coronavirus, and then basically they can sort of dispose of him and all the blame for the rights and wrongs and everything to do with the coronavirus pandemic and the response to it, whatever I guess people's opinions are on it, that can sort of be consigned to him. And I think the next person who takes over from him will sort of try and really brush that or push, pass the buck onto him, really try and make it seem like a lot of it was his responsibility, which obviously it was. But my concern is, let's say someone like Rishi Sunak is the challenger in 18 months' time, a couple years' time, whenever. Realistically, they were heavily involved in that, so I don't really know how that's going to work as an argument. But I do think that right now, if you're thinking as a minister in the Conservative Party, it's not the right time for a leadership challenge. Whatever they're harbouring inside themselves, feelings about Boris Johnson or their own personal ambitions, this would not be the right time for an ambitious minister to want to take over, I don't think.
Georgia, thank you very much indeed. Andrew, can I bring you in on that issue? I'm wondering what, say, someone like Dominic Cummings might be thinking right now. Any thoughts on that, Andrew?
Well, Dominic Cummings might be thinking, maybe it depends if he's sitting on anything good that he wants to get out into the media, or waiting for the moment, or whether he knows there's more to come. He's hinted at all of that. I think he's probably appearing an increasingly less relevant person. I think each of his interventions makes less of an impact, but it's certainly been a pain. I think on the mechanics of how, and I agree with what both the other fellow panelists have said, that we certainly shouldn't assume it's going to be gone by Christmas by any means, or writing off. It's interesting to think about the mechanics of how Johnson might be removed whenever that may happen. Is that the mechanism of the Conservative Party is not that a challenger comes forward as such, or that there might be one waiting in the room, is that MPs right to the chair of the 1922 group, with the body for kind of almost the trade union, although they maybe don't like that term, the Conservative MPs, and once a certain number, I think 54 MPs, 15% of the total, is reached expressing no confidence in the leader, then there is a vote of MPs, and if the incumbent leader fails to secure half the votes, i.e. there's a vote of no confidence in their leadership, then they have to resign, then a leadership election happens in which they can't take part. So that's probably the most likely mechanic by which Johnson could be removed, were he to be removed. Then at that point, anyone who wanted to throw their hat in the ring could come forward. Now, obviously, before then, a potential successor may have done some subtle kind of canvassing, and people in the party would obviously be thinking about who might come next. But it's interesting to think about those mechanics, how they might play out. That's why I think it's certainly not going to happen this side of Christmas, or indeed, it's not in immediate prospect, because it does require all those things to happen. Now, obviously, it potentially, Johnson, if things got really bad, could be prevailed upon just to resign of his own accord without waiting for that to happen. But again, I think things would have to still
It's unlikely to imagine that someone with his sense of self, should we say, to put it nicely, would consider that kind of thing. Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Final word from Philip here in the studio. Who would step into his shoes?
Well, there are two people hovering overhead like vultures. One of them is, as we just heard, Rishi Sunak, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, and the other one is Liz Truss, who is the current Foreign Secretary or the Foreign Minister of the UK. They both are putting already forward feelers that they would be willing to take over the Tory party leadership. The problem for Boris Johnson is that we've seen previous Prime Ministers and Tory leaders be ousted, notably Margaret Thatcher back in 1990, when you had Theresa May in 2019. It was not easy to get rid of Margaret Thatcher because she had a very big support base. She had a lot of people who were willing to support her. Boris Johnson doesn't have that. He has a very small base compared to that Margaret Thatcher or Theresa May had, which means that he is in a more vulnerable position from within the party. So that will be something to keep an eye on to see just how much he can build back that support that we've been talking about all the way through, or face being evicted before the next general election. But that's still quite a long way off yet, and I agree that this is a bad time to do it right in the middle of a COVID crisis, but it doesn't mean he's out of the woods yet.
Indeed, he could be the fall guy. He could be the knight in shining armour. Hard to say with Johnson, isn't it? And it often depends kind of how you stand politically, but also how you feel about the way he conducts his business. Philip, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to our guests joining us from London. Georgia Gilholy, political reporter with politico.co.uk and commentator with Young Voices UK. Georgia, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Andrew Blick, head of the Department of Political Economy and Reader in Politics and Contemporary History at King's College in London. Thank you all. Most of all, thanks to you for watching. Stay with us, more to come here. You're watching France 24.